Sarah Martinez pulled her faded denim jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into the upscale restaurant. The fabric, once a deep indigo, had weathered to a pale blue after years of wear, and several small tears near the elbows had been carefully mended with patches of slightly different shades. She knew she looked out of place among the polished clientele in their designer suits and elegant dresses, but this wasn't a social visit. At 28, Sarah worked 3 jobs to support her younger brother's medical treatments. During the day, she cleaned office buildings downtown. In the evenings, she waited tables at a diner near the hospital. On weekends, she did alterations for a local tailor. The jacket had belonged to her father, Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before an improvised explosive device changed everything. The restaurant manager, a thin man with slicked back hair, approached her with barely concealed disdain. "Excuse me, miss, but we have a dress code here. I'm afraid that jacket isn't appropriate for our establishment." His voice carried the practiced politeness of someone accustomed to turning away undesirable customers. Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she stood her ground. "I'm here to meet Mrs. Henderson about catering her daughter's wedding. She specifically requested to meet me here." She had spent weeks perfecting recipes for the event, hoping this contract would finally give her enough money to start her own catering business. The manager's expression softened slightly, but his disapproval remained evident. "Very well, but please keep the jacket minimal." He gestured vaguely at her attire before walking away, muttering something about standards. Other patrons had begun to notice the commotion. A group of well-dressed women at a nearby table whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Sarah's worn clothing. One of them, wearing a pearl necklace that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, spoke loud enough for her to hear. "I can't believe they let people dress like that in here. It's simply inappropriate. That jacket looks like it belongs in a thrift store." Her companions giggled softly, their eyes fixed on Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Sarah felt her hands tremble slightly as she smoothed down the jacket's worn fabric. The patch on the left sleeve, a small rectangular piece with frayed edges, had been there for as long as she could remember. Her father had never explained its significance, only saying it was important and that she should take care of it after he was gone. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the entrance, scanning the room with sharp eyes. She was a prominent socialite known for hosting elaborate events, and landing this contract could change Sarah's life. But as the older woman approached, her gaze fell on Sarah's jacket, and her perfectly painted lips pursed in disapproval. "Miss Martinez, I presume." Mrs. Henderson's tone was cool, professional, but tinged with disappointment. "I must say, I was expecting someone more presentable for such an important discussion." Sarah's heart sank, but she forced a smile. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for my appearance. I came directly from work." She had actually changed into her best clothes, but the jacket was the only outerwear she owned that was warm enough for the unusually cold evening. As they were seated at a corner table, Sarah noticed how other diners continued to stare. A businessman in an expensive suit shook his head as he passed their table, and a young couple pointed discreetly while whispering to each other. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Mrs. Henderson opened the conversation by discussing her vision for the wedding reception, but her attention seemed divided. Her eyes kept drifting to Sarah's jacket, particularly to the mysterious patch that had drawn so much unwanted attention throughout the evening. "I have to ask," Mrs. Henderson said, interrupting her own description of the desired menu. "Is that jacket some sort of fashion statement? Because I must say, it's quite distracting from our business discussion." Sarah's face burned with embarrassment. The snickers from neighboring tables grew more audible, and she caught fragments of comments about her appearance. Someone mentioned the jacket looked like it had seen better days, while another voice suggested she should invest in proper attire if she wanted to run a business. The humiliation was overwhelming. Sarah had worked so hard to get to this point, sacrificing sleep and comfort to perfect her culinary skills and build a reputation for excellent food. But none of that seemed to matter when measured against the judgment of her worn, patched jacket. She considered removing the jacket, but the restaurant's air conditioning was too strong, and, besides, the simple blouse underneath wasn't much more impressive. More importantly, Taking off her father's jacket felt like abandoning the last tangible connection she had to his memory. As Mrs. Henderson continued her critique of Sarah's appearance, the young woman's confidence crumbled. This meeting represented months of hope and planning, but it was clear that her potential client was more concerned with image than with the quality of her food or the passion behind her work. Sarah tried to redirect the conversation back to the catering menu, pulling out a carefully prepared folder containing photos of her dishes and detailed cost breakdowns. Her hands shook slightly as she spread the materials across the white tablecloth, acutely aware that several nearby diners were still watching her with obvious amusement. As you can see, Mrs. Henderson, I've prepared 3 different menu options for your daughter's reception, Sarah began, her voice steadier than she felt. Each one incorporates the seasonal ingredients you mentioned, and I've calculated portions for 200 guests. But Mrs. Henderson barely glanced at the beautifully arranged portfolio. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her expression growing increasingly skeptical. Miss Martinez, I have to be honest with you. When my friend recommended your services, she led me to believe you were a more established professional. This presentation is lovely, but I'm concerned about your ability to handle an event of this magnitude. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had catered events for up to 150 people, working with minimal equipment, and somehow managing to exceed every client's expectations. Her reputation was built on hard work, creativity, and an obsessive attention to detail that compensated for her lack of expensive equipment. A waiter approached their table, his expression apologetic but firm. Excuse me, ladies, but we've received some complaints about the dress code. Perhaps the lady with the jacket could consider. He gestured helplessly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but bound by restaurant policy. Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow and looked meaningfully at Sarah. Perhaps it would be best if you addressed this issue. We can't continue our discussion with such distractions. Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over, but she blinked them back. I understand your concerns, but this jacket has sentimental value. My father served in Afghanistan, and Miss Martinez, Mrs. Henderson interrupted with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. I'm sure your father's service was admirable, but this is a business meeting. Personal sentimentality has no place in professional discussions. The cruelty of the statement left Sarah momentarily speechless. Around them, other patrons had grown bolder in their observations. An elderly man at a nearby table made no effort to lower his voice as he commented to his companion about the decline in standards and how some people simply don't understand appropriate public behavior. Sarah gathered her materials with trembling hands, her carefully prepared presentation scattered and wrinkled. 6 months of work and planning were dissolving before her eyes, not because her food wasn't exceptional or her prices weren't competitive, but because she couldn't afford to dress the part that society expected of a successful businesswoman. I think perhaps we should reschedule this meeting, Mrs. Henderson said, though her tone suggested no genuine intention of doing so. When you're more appropriately dressed for a professional discussion. As Sarah stood to leave, clutching her folder of rejected proposals, she became aware of a new presence in the restaurant. Near the entrance, a distinguished older man had entered, wearing a crisp military dress uniform adorned with ribbons and insignia. His bearing was unmistakably that of a career military officer, and his presence commanded immediate respect from the restaurant staff. The general, for his rank was clearly visible on his uniform, was being escorted to a table by the same manager who had earlier criticized Sarah's appearance. But, as he passed through the dining room, his sharp eyes swept across the various patrons, taking in the scene with the practiced observation of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly. His gaze fell on Sarah as she prepared to leave, and something about her worn jacket seemed to catch his attention. The general slowed his pace, his expression shifting from casual observation to focused interest. The small patch on Sarah's sleeve, barely visible to most observers, had somehow captured his complete attention. Sarah noticed his stare and felt a fresh wave of embarrassment. Even a military officer was judging her appearance, adding to the humiliation of an already devastating evening. She clutched her father's jacket more tightly around her shoulders and hurried toward the exit, desperate to escape the scrutiny of the entire restaurant. But the general's reaction was unlike the others. Instead of disapproval or amusement, his face showed something approaching shock. He stopped walking entirely, his eyes fixed on the patch with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. His aide, a younger officer accompanying him, noticed the general's sudden halt and followed his gaze with confusion. The dining room's atmosphere had shifted. The general's unexpected pause created a moment of tension that seemed to silence the previous whispers and snickers. Other patrons sensed that something significant was happening, though they couldn't understand what had captured the military officer's attention so completely. Mrs. Henderson, still seated at their table, watched the scene unfold with growing curiosity. The restaurant manager approached the general with obvious concern, clearly worried that something was wrong with their distinguished guest. But the general barely acknowledged the manager's presence, his attention completely absorbed by the young woman in the worn denim jacket. General William Thompson had served 42 years in the United States Army, rising through the ranks from a young second lieutenant to his current position as a three-star general. He had seen combat in 3 different conflicts, commanded thousands of soldiers, and been decorated for both valor and leadership. But nothing in his extensive military experience had prepared him for the shock of recognition that struck him as he observed the patch on Sarah's jacket. The patch was small, roughly rectangular, with edges that had frayed over years of wear. To most observers, it appeared to be nothing more than a piece of fabric used to repair a tear in old clothing. But General Thompson recognized it immediately as a unit patch from the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, a unit he had commanded during some of the fiercest fighting in Afghanistan's Helmand province. More than that, the specific wear pattern, the unique fading, and a small modification to the standard design told him exactly whose patch this had been. Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez had sewn that patch onto his jacket himself, adding a tiny symbol that wasn't part of the official design, a small cross that his daughter Sarah had drawn for him before his deployment. Sarah had almost reached the restaurant's exit when she heard a voice behind her call out. "Excuse me, miss. Could you wait just a moment?" The voice carried the unmistakable authority of command, causing her to stop and turn around reluctantly. General Thompson approached her slowly, his aide following at a respectful distance. The entire restaurant had fallen silent, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Even Mrs. Henderson had risen from her seat to get a better view of the unexpected drama. "That patch on your jacket," the general said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Could you tell me where you got it?" Sarah's first instinct was to flee. She had endured enough humiliation for one evening and wasn't prepared for another public examination of her appearance. But something in the general's tone stopped her, not judgment or criticism, but what sounded almost like reverence. "It belonged to my father," she said quietly, unconsciously protective of the jacket. "Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez. He served in Afghanistan." The general's expression softened, and Sarah noticed that his eyes had become slightly misty. "Miguel Martinez," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the name. "3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry." Sarah nodded, surprised that this stranger knew her father's unit designation. "Yes, sir. He died 3 years ago from complications related to his injuries." What happened next would be talked about in that restaurant for years to come. General Thompson, a man whose presence commanded respect from presidents and foreign dignitaries, slowly and deliberately came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute to the young woman in the worn denim jacket. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Waiters stopped mid-stride, conversations died at every table, and even the background music seemed to fade away. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open in shock, while the manager who had earlier criticized Sarah's attire turned pale with realization. "Your father," the general said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed dining room, "was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command. He saved my life, and the lives of 14 other men, on a day when everything went wrong in that godforsaken desert." Sarah felt her knees weaken as the general's words sank in. Her father had rarely spoken about his service, deflecting her questions with jokes or changes of subject. She knew he had been wounded and that he struggled with the physical and emotional aftermath, but he had never told her about any heroic actions. General Thompson lowered his salute, but maintained his respectful posture. It was August 15th, 2009. Our convoy hit an IED about 20 miles outside of Forward Operating Base Jackson. The blast flipped our lead vehicle and trapped several soldiers underneath. Your father was in the rear vehicle, but instead of taking cover when we started receiving enemy fire, he ran into the kill zone to help extract the wounded. The general paused, visibly struggling with the memory. Miguel pulled 3 unconscious soldiers from that wreckage while bullets were flying all around him. He went back 2 more times, even after taking shrapnel in his leg and arm. On his final trip, he pulled me out just before the vehicle's fuel tank exploded. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she listened to her father's story for the first time. The general continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Your father spent 4 days in the field hospital before he was stable enough to be evacuated. When I visited him, he was more concerned about his daughter back home than his own injuries. He showed me a picture of you and said you were going to be a chef someday, that you were already a better cook than any mess hall he'd ever eaten in. The restaurant patrons who had earlier mocked Sarah's appearance now sat in stunned silence, many with expressions of shame and regret. The woman with the pearl necklace had tears streaming down her cheeks, while the businessman who had shaken his head in disapproval was staring at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Mrs. Henderson slowly approached their conversation, her face pale with embarrassment. General, I had no idea. Miss Martinez, I owe you a tremendous apology. My behavior tonight was inexcusable. But General Thompson wasn't finished. He reached into his dress uniform's pocket and withdrew a small, rectangular object, a military decoration case. Your father was recommended for the Silver Star for his actions that day. The paperwork got lost in the bureaucracy after he was transferred to medical care, and by the time I tracked it down, Miguel had already left the service. I've been carrying this for 3 years, hoping someday I'd find a way to get it to his family. Sarah's hands trembled as General Thompson placed the metal case in her palms. The weight of it seemed enormous, not because of its physical mass, but because of everything it represented about her father's courage and sacrifice. She had spent years believing that Miguel Martinez was simply a good man who had served his country, but she was learning that he was a genuine hero whose actions had saved lives. Open it, the general said gently, his own voice thick with emotion. With careful fingers, Sarah lifted the lid of the case. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, lay the Silver Star, a bronze star suspended from a ribbon of red, white, and blue stripes. The metal caught the restaurant's ambient lighting and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. Engraved on a small plaque beneath it were the words, Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, for gallantry in action, Afghanistan, August 15, 2009. The sight of her father's name officially commemorated for his heroism broke something loose inside Sarah's chest. She began to cry, not the tears of embarrassment and frustration that had threatened earlier, but tears of pride, grief, and overwhelming gratitude. Her father had died without ever receiving the recognition he deserved, but somehow, in this impossible moment, his sacrifice was finally being acknowledged. General Thompson reached into his other pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. There's more, he said softly. This is a copy of the citation I wrote for your father. I thought you should know exactly what he did that day. Sarah unfolded the document with shaking hands and began to read aloud, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy, Staff Sergeant Martinez repeatedly exposed himself to hostile fire to rescue wounded comrades from a burning vehicle. His selfless courage under extreme combat conditions upheld the finest traditions of military service and reflected great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. The restaurant remained completely silent as her words echoed through the dining room. Several patrons were openly weeping, including the manager who had earlier asked her to leave. Mrs. Henderson stood with her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes red with unshed tears. Your father talked about you constantly during his recovery, General Thompson continued. He was so proud of your determination to build something meaningful with your life. He said you had inherited your grandmother's gift for cooking and your mother's stubborn refusal to give up on anything important. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked up at the general. He never told me about any of this. I knew he was wounded, but he always changed the subject when I asked about what happened. That's typical of the best soldiers, the general replied. They don't see themselves as heroes. They just see themselves as people who did what needed to be done. Your father probably thought his real achievement was raising a daughter who would make a difference in the world. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward hesitantly. Miss Martinez, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for my behavior tonight. I made assumptions based on appearances, and I treated you with disrespect that you never deserved. Your father's service and sacrifice, they put my petty concerns about fashion and appearances in perspective. Sarah looked at the older woman, seeing genuine remorse in her eyes. Mrs. Henderson, you couldn't have known. I understand why you— No, Mrs. Henderson interrupted firmly. There's no excuse for judging someone based on their clothing or treating anyone with the dismissive attitude I showed you tonight. Your father fought for the freedom of people like me to live our comfortable lives, and I repaid that sacrifice by treating his daughter poorly because of a jacket. The general cleared his throat. If I may ask, what business were you ladies discussing before I interrupted? Mrs. Henderson explained the catering contract for her daughter's wedding, describing how she had dismissed Sarah's qualifications based purely on her appearance. As she spoke, her shame became more apparent, and her voice grew smaller with each detail of her judgmental behavior. General Thompson listened carefully, then turned to Sarah. Your father mentioned that you were working towards starting your own catering business. How is that progressing? Sarah explained her current situation, the 3 jobs, her brother's medical expenses, and the constant struggle to save enough money to properly equip a commercial kitchen. She described her dream of eventually opening a small restaurant that would honor her grandmother's recipes while incorporating techniques she had learned from working in professional kitchens. Mrs. Henderson, the general said quietly, I believe you have an opportunity to make amends for tonight's misunderstanding. And, Miss Martinez, you have an opportunity to honor your father's memory by showing the same courage in pursuing your dreams that he showed in combat. The restaurant manager appeared at the general's elbow, his face flushed with embarrassment. General, sir, I want to apologize profusely for the way I treated this young lady tonight. If I had known about her father's service, about what that jacket represented. General Thompson fixed the manager with a steady stare. The problem, sir, is not that you didn't know about her father's service. The problem is that you judge someone based on their appearance rather than their character. Every person who enters your establishment deserves basic dignity and respect, regardless of how much their clothing cost. The manager nodded vigorously, clearly understanding that he was receiving a lesson in leadership from someone who had spent decades teaching others about honor and integrity. Yes, sir. You're absolutely right. Miss Martinez, please accept my deepest apologies. Your meal tonight is complimentary, and you're welcome in our establishment anytime. Sarah looked around the restaurant at the faces watching her. Faces that had earlier shown derision and amusement now displayed respect, embarrassment, and something approaching awe. The transformation was remarkable, but it also felt somewhat hollow. These same people had been quick to judge and mock her just minutes earlier, and their change of attitude seemed to depend entirely on external validation from the general's revelation. Mrs. Henderson took a deep breath and stepped closer to Sarah. Miss Martinez, I would like to offer you the catering contract for my daughter's wedding. But more than that, I want to make a personal investment in your business. My husband and I have been looking for meaningful ways to give back to the community, and supporting the daughter of a war hero seems like exactly the right place to start. Sarah's mind reeled as Mrs. Henderson continued. I'm prepared to offer you a $5,000 advance on the wedding catering, plus an additional $10,000 investment in your business equipment. Consider it a small way of honoring your father's sacrifice. The offer was staggering, more money than Sarah had ever imagined having at one time. With that investment, she could lease a proper commercial kitchen, buy professional-grade equipment, and, finally, leave her exhausting cycle of multiple jobs. But something about accepting charity based on her father's heroism felt wrong to her. Mrs. Henderson, I'm deeply grateful for your offer, Sarah said carefully. But I need to earn this opportunity based on my cooking ability, not because of what my father did. I don't want success that comes from pity or guilt. General Thompson smiled for the first time since entering the restaurant. Your father would be proud to hear you say that. He always said the most important thing he could teach you was to stand on your own feet and earn your way in the world. Mrs. Henderson nodded respectfully. You're absolutely right, and I apologize for making it sound like charity. Let me rephrase. I would like to hire you for my daughter's wedding based on your portfolio, which I was too prejudiced to properly examine earlier. The advance payment is standard business practice. As for the additional investment, I'd like to propose a business partnership. I have capital, but no culinary expertise. You have incredible talent, but need funding. Together, we could create something special. Sarah considered the proposal carefully. A business partnership was different from charity. It would require her to prove herself and deliver results. Mrs. Henderson would be investing in Sarah's abilities, not just making amends for her earlier behavior. General Thompson had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. Sarah, may I call you Sarah? When she nodded, he continued. Your father and I had many conversations during his recovery about what it means to serve others. He believed that everyone has a way to make the world a little better, whether that's through military service, raising children, teaching, cooking, or any number of other paths. He saw your cooking as your way of serving others, bringing people together, and creating joy. The general paused, looking directly into Sarah's eyes. Don't let pride prevent you from accepting help when it's offered in good faith. Your father accepted help from his fellow soldiers when he needed it, and he gave help when others needed it. That's how communities work, how society functions. Sometimes we give, sometimes we receive, but we're all stronger when we support each other. Sarah felt tears returning to her eyes, but these were different tears, tears of possibility rather than despair. She looked around the restaurant one more time, seeing the faces of people who had learned something important about judging others. The lesson wouldn't stick for everyone, but perhaps some of them would remember this moment the next time they were tempted to dismiss someone based on appearances. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah said finally, I'd like to accept your business proposition. But I have one condition. I want to cater a monthly dinner for local veterans and their families. Free of charge. It would be my way of honoring not just my father, but all the men and women who serve. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. That's a wonderful idea. I'd like to help fund those dinners as well. My late brother served in Vietnam, and he would have loved something like that when he came home. General Thompson reached into his jacket pocket once more and pulled out a business card. Sarah, I'd like you to have this. It's the contact information for a veteran support organization I'm involved with. They're always looking for ways to help military families, and I think your dinner idea could be the start of something much larger. As the evening continued, Sarah found herself sitting at a table with General Thompson, Mrs. Henderson, and several other restaurant patrons who had approached to apologize for their earlier behavior. The conversation ranged from her father's service to her culinary dreams, from the challenges facing veterans to the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. The woman with the pearl necklace, whose name turned out to be Margaret Stevens, shared that her own son was currently deployed overseas. She had never considered what life might be like for military families struggling with financial difficulties while dealing with the aftermath of service. Meeting Sarah had opened her eyes to realities she had never imagined. The businessman who had earlier shaken his head in disapproval introduced himself as Robert Chun, owner of several local restaurants. He offered Sarah a consulting contract to develop new menu items for his establishments, providing another stream of income that would help stabilize her finances while she built her own business. As the evening wound down, Sarah carefully folded her father's Silver Star citation and placed it back in the metal case. The patch on her jacket, the same patch that had caused so much initial derision, now felt like a badge of honor rather than a source of shame. General Thompson stood to leave, but before departing, he saluted Sarah once more. Your father would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become and of the path you're choosing. You're carrying on his tradition of service in your own unique way. 6 months later, Sarah's catering business had grown beyond her wildest dreams. The monthly veterans' dinners had evolved into a full program providing not just meals, but also job training and support services for military families. Mrs. Henderson had become not just a business partner, but a close friend and mentor. Sarah still wore her father's jacket, though she now had a closet full of professional attire. The patch remained in its place of honor on the sleeve, a reminder that true worth comes from character and service, not from the cost of one's clothing. The restaurant where it all began had instituted a new policy, a discount for all active military personnel and veterans, and staff training on treating every customer with dignity regardless of their appearance. The manager kept a photo on his desk from the night when General Thompson's presence had taught everyone an unforgettable lesson about respect and the danger of superficial judgments. But, perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned to see her father's sacrifice not as a burden of expectation, but as a foundation of strength upon which she could build something meaningful. Every meal she prepared, every veteran she served, every person who gathered around her tables was a continuation of Miguel Martinez's legacy of service and love.